This week, without any surprises, Taiwan continues to get good economic news as real wages grew at their fastest pace for any first quarter in 11 years. The island's weighing in the MSCI Emerging Market Index was upgraded once again, and TSMC, Taiwan's biggest company, the AI tech giant, despite a brief wobble over an Apple Intel report, is still up over 45% since January. And the Taiex, Taiwan's benchmark stock index, has surged over 44% since the start of the year. So, by any measure, Taiwan, once again, continues to thrive. But this week also brought something else. A U.S. president landed in Beijing for the first time in nearly a decade. Two leaders sat down for 2 hours in the Great Hall of the People, and when they came out, China's state media had one message above all others. Taiwan is the most important issue in the U.S.-China relationship. Handle it wrong, Xi told Trump, and the two countries could face clashes, even conflicts. The economic number and this warning are both pointing at the same underlying question, one that nobody in the celebration is asking about loudly. How secure is Taiwan's prosperity when the terms of the world that it depends on are being renegotiated right now in a room where Taiwan isn't invited into? We've explored that theme many times on this show, but let's continue to dig deeper this week on Beyond the Reefs. Hi, you're listening to Beyond the Reefs, a show produced by Radio Taiwan International. Here we talk about socioeconomic issues that are faced by Taiwan and their broader impact around the world beyond the reefs of this island nation.
During a high-stakes meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump in Beijing, Chinese President Xi Jinping warned that mishandling of Taiwan could push U.S.-China relations into a dangerous place. It was a comment that featured prominently in Beijing's summary of their first day of talks, while the U.S.'s own readout did not mention Taiwan at all. And when reporters asked Trump whether he had talked about Taiwan, he didn't answer.
It's great.
Did you talk about Taiwan?
Great place. Incredible. China's beautiful.
Analysts say this shows restraint and maybe a good sign for Taipei.
Trump has been very measured and controlled on how much he talks about Taiwan. So the lack of language on Taiwan from the U.S. side is somewhat also expected, but also welcome, especially from Taiwan's side. It shows that Trump is still able to show restraint when talking about Taiwan and is only going to do so if necessary.
Following the meeting, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio did make some comments on Taiwan. He said U.S. policy towards Taiwan remains unchanged and warned it would be a mistake for China to take Taiwan by force. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says Trump himself will say more on Taiwan in the coming days. Taipei so far has appeared to remain calm. Its Mainland Affairs Council, which handles relations with China, calling Beijing's comments unsurprising, and Taiwan's foreign ministry thanking the U.S. for its support of Taiwan and cross-strait peace. But some here are still uneasy.
我感觉有点不太靠谱，因为川普他有时候就是说一套做一套，所以我觉得也不能完全相信他们。
我觉得这一定要担心的，这对台湾的影响非常大，那美国到底会不会，川普到底会不会背叛台湾？我觉得这是非常关键的，对台湾来说，这非常关键。基本上我是不太相信川普。
Meanwhile, the U.S. and China are speaking positively about relations. Xi said at a banquet Thursday night that it's the most important relationship in the world, while Trump invited Xi to visit the U.S. in September. And people in Taiwan will be watching how these warming ties will impact the country.
Before we get to the meat of the show this week, here's what's been happening in Taiwan. Last week, we talked about the quiet pressure building on Taiwan's semiconductor supply chain, about how the AI boom was concentrating demand at the very top of the market, and how that concentration was both Taiwan's greatest strength and its most exposed flank. Now this week, the data confirmed the strength side of that equation. Taiwan's real average regular wages rose 1.45% year on year in the first quarter, the largest increase for the same period since 2015. That's 11 years ago. When you factor in bonuses and overtime, total real earnings rose nearly 2%. The statistics agency pointed directly at AI-related sectors as the driver. More overtime, bigger bonuses, year-end payouts. The AI boom isn't just lifting stock prices, it's showing up in workers' paychecks. That's pretty good. Meanwhile, MSCI upgraded Taiwan's weighting in its Emerging Market Index by 0.3 percentage points, the largest hike of any market in this review cycle. Taiwan's TSMC alone accounts for 58.33% of the MSCI Taiwan Index. And despite a brief sell-off on Monday triggered by the Wall Street Journal report that Apple is exploring Intel as a second chip supplier, analysts were largely dismissive of that news. TSMC is in mass production of its 2nm process. Intel reported a 90% yield in a trial run, but a trial run is not mass production. So the picture is strong. The fundamentals are sound, and yet the Trump-Xi summit, which concluded in Beijing on Thursday, is asking a question that the fundamentals alone can't answer. Taiwan is thriving as the indispensable supplier in a technological competition between the world's two largest economies. What happens to that position when the two sides start negotiating the terms of that competition directly, without Taiwan in the room? Well, let's start with what Taiwan actually is in the current global economy. I think it's fair to say that the US and China are locked in a technological arms race. Both sides need more weapons. Taiwan makes them. And then when both sides are buying, the arms dealer prosper. That's the mechanism behind every positive data point Taiwan reported this week. The AI boom isn't just an abstract trend, it's a specific demand surge for the most advanced chips in the world, produced at scale by exactly one company, TSMC. Nvidia, on the other hand, its market cap hit $5.7 trillion this week and is pushing towards $6 trillion. Remember years ago when it was crazy to think that one company was market cap at over $1 trillion? Well, now we're many folds beyond that. Every NVIDIA GPU that goes into a data center anywhere in the world was almost certainly fabbed in Taiwan. So the wage growth, the MSCI upgrade, the stock market rally, all of it flows from that single structural fact. And the arms dealer is good at his or her job. Taiwan's 2nm process is in mass production. Intel's equivalent is still in trial runs. TSMC's clients, NVIDIA, Apple, AMD, and a growing roster of AI hyperscalers have no realistic alternative. The pricing power is real. The lead is real. But here's the thing about being an arms dealer. Okay, maybe we should stop using that word. Here's the thing about being an AI boom supplier. Your prosperity depends on the AI boom continuing. And this week, the two biggest buyers sat down together in Beijing. And let's be clear about what the Trump-Xi summit produced, because the headlines and the reality aren't always the same thing. On the economic side, the deliverables were real. China agreed to purchase 200 Boeing aircraft, a major order for a company that's been largely frozen out of the Chinese market for years. The U.S. Commerce Department approved roughly 10 Chinese firms to purchase NVIDIA H200 chips, which is why Jensen Huang was called on Air Force One last minute. Now, this is a partial but meaningful relaxation of the export controls that had been a centerpiece of U.S. tech policy towards China. Citibank received approval for a wholly foreign-owned securities license in China. The two sides announced plans to reduce tariffs on roughly $30 billion worth of U.S. goods. None of this is a grand reconciliation. The two sides announced plans to reduce tariffs on roughly $30 billion worth of goods. Now, none of this is a grand reconciliation. The most sensitive technology, advanced AI chips above the H200 level, those cutting-edge semiconductor equipment, anything touching national security, they stayed off the table. The 187 Chinese tech companies on the Pentagon's blacklist they're still there. Huawei, CITIC, CXMT, YMTC, they're all still listed. The structural tech war didn't end. It just got a partial truce in one corner of it. But that partial truce matters for Taiwan because what the H200 approval signals is this. Chip access is now a literal bargaining chip. The U.S. is willing to use semiconductor export policy as a diplomatic instrument, something to offer, something to trade with. That's a different world from the one where export controls were treated as fixed national security line just years ago. If China's average tariff burden comes down, if the preferential treatment that drove manufacturing orders towards Taiwan and Southeast Asia get partially reversed, the transfer order effect that Taiwan has been riding starts to narrow. Or would it? I don't know. It doesn't disappear overnight, but the direction might change. Now, here's where it gets complicated because the summit didn't just produce economic outcomes. It produced two completely different public accounts of what happened. China's state-run Xinhua agency reported that Xi Jinping told Trump the Taiwan question is, quote, the most important issue in the U.S.-China relationship. They say that mishandling this could lead to, quote, clashes and even conflicts, that Taiwan independence and cross-strait peace are not negotiable. Taiwanese experts call it the strongest public language Beijing has used on Taiwan in years, notably more forceful than past formulations, with explicit military undertones. However, the White House readout mentioned Taiwan 0 times. It focused on economic cooperation, Iran, and bilateral exchanges. As far as Washington's official account is concerned, Taiwan simply wasn't a major topic. Who was right? Well, probably both in their own ways. Beijing needs to show its domestic audience and its military establishment that it pressed hard on the issue that matters most to them. Washington, on the other hand, needs to show markets and allies that the summit was transactional and constructive and not a forum for relitigating the status quo. Both accounts serve their intended audiences, but Taiwan lives in the gap between them. Patrick Kim at the Brookings Institution described it as a fundamental gap in interpretation. Washington didn't support Taiwan independence, but it also believes arming Taiwan is necessary to prevent Taipei from being forced into negotiations under duress. Beijing views those same arms sales as evidence that Washington is encouraging the very independence it claims to oppose. Neither side is lying. They simply have incompatible readings of the same policy. And that incompatibility has been sitting unresolved for decades. Quietly, mostly, this week, Xi chose to say it out loud. So, what does Taiwan's actual security guarantee look like? And how much does this week change it? Well, the reassuring signals are real. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said explicitly after the summit that U.S. policy on Taiwan has not changed. Thomas Shattuck at the University of Pennsylvania made an argument worth sitting with. The White House decision to omit Taiwan from its readout is in itself a signal. It means that Washington doesn't see Taiwan as a negotiating item. You don't omit from a readout the things you gave away. You omit the things you refuse to put on the table. And then there is the structural point about arms sales that Shattuck also made, a point that cuts to the heart of how Trump actually thinks about this. When Taiwan buys weapons through the U.S. foreign military sales process, that creates American jobs. For a president who ran on manufacturing and economic nationalism, blocking Taiwan arms sales means hurting American defense contractors. Trump may be unpredictable on Taiwan's political status, but he is extremely predictable on American jobs, American market performances. So here's the limit of that reassurance. Congressional commitments to Taiwan, the Taiwan Relations Act, the more recent legislation signaling support for Taiwan's defense, represent the legislative floor. They define the minimum. The president operates above that floor with significant discretion, and Trump has demonstrated across his 2 terms that he treats every relationship as transactional in progress. Now, this week he came to Beijing wanting Boeing orders, agricultural purchases, energy deals, and H200 sales. He got most of them, but Taiwan wasn't in that package, or at least by their readout. The question isn't whether Trump would trade Taiwan deliberately, it's whether the accumulation of transactions, each individually defensible, each producing real economic wins, whether that gradually reshapes the environment in a way that narrows Taiwan's room to maneuver. Now, if the 2 sides produce a joint statement, if Xi visits Washington in September and Trump and Xi stand together, draft a communique with Taiwan not involved, then the story will be different. But that hasn't happened. So Chinese President Xi Jinping raised the Thucydides trap himself in the meeting. Now, this is a theory that a rising power and an established hegemon are structurally prone to conflict. He raised it, analysts note it, to suggest that China and the U.S. could find a way to share power without war, the way Britain and America did in the early 20th century. Now, the U.S.-China competition isn't really about territory or military dominance in the traditional sense. It's about who controls the technology that defines the next era of economic and military power. Chips, AI, quantum computing. Whoever loses that race loses geopolitical leverage, regardless of how many aircraft carriers they have. If that's right, then the real battlefield was never Taiwan's beaches. It's Taiwan's fabs, fabrication labs, and that changes the nature of Taiwan's exposure significantly. Taiwan isn't just a geopolitical flashpoint. It's the most strategically valuable piece of industrial infrastructure on the planet. Now, that's a form of protection in itself. If the technology competition is what actually matters, then both sides have reasons to want Taiwan's capabilities and reasons to want to control what Taiwan does with them. The Nobel economist Peter Howitt, speaking in Taipei this week, said something that's worth holding alongside all of this. He said manufacturing employment was falling in almost every country even before AI. AI will accelerate that. The jobs of the future won't be in factories. Taiwan's extraordinary current prosperity is built on being the world's best at a form of advanced manufacturing. That advantage is real and durable for now. But durable for now is not the same as permanent. At some point, this technological arms race will have to end, or transform, or get negotiated into something that looks like a managed coexistence. And when it does, Taiwan will need something beyond the fab. How quickly can the country pivot? We don't know. So here we are. Taiwan had a genuinely good week. The wages are up, the index rating is up, the stock market is up, and TSMC's technological lead remains intact. The Xi and Trump summit produced reassurance, not concessions. Rubio said the policy hasn't changed. The White House is silent on Taiwan. Analysts are arguing that it's a statement of non-negotiability. But the summit also showed us something about the architecture Taiwan depends on. It's not fixed. It's a negotiation ongoing, driven by interests that don't always map cleanly onto Taiwan's own interests. The legislative commitments from the U.S. are real. The presidential discretion, well, it's also real. What Trump does with the decisions made by Congress and the Commons, it's up to him. Taiwan's indispensability is, well, a protection, but not a guarantee. When two great powers agree to stop fighting in one arena, they don't necessarily stop competing. They find a new arena, but the host of that old arena is obviously going to see fewer businesses. So the question Taiwan needs to answer urgently and without illusions is whether it's positioned for the next one, or whether it's still counting on a war that's quietly being settled. I'm Joey Cho. Tune in next week to find out about socioeconomic issues that are faced by Taiwan and their broader impact around the world beyond the reefs of this island nation.